The Dying Sun and the Ghost Town. The sun was a dying ember over the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Sierra Madre. It was a deep, bleeding red that stained the horizon, casting shadows that stretched across the valley like the long, dark fingers of a forgotten god. Down in that valley, nestled between the dry earth and the silent rocks, Rattlesnake Gulch sat like a rotting carcass. It was a place abandoned by God and forgotten by every law of man. 10 years ago, this soil breathed gold. It breathed gunpowder, sweat, and the wild, frantic dreams of men who wanted to be kings. Now, the gold was gone, and the kings were all buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Now, Rattlesnake Gulch only breathed dust. He arrived when the shadows were at their absolute longest, just as the light was losing its fight against the coming night. He wasn't a man who made a sound when he moved. He arrived like a shift in the weather, a sudden chill that makes you pull your coat tighter. A tall, lean figure emerged from the haze of the desert, clad in a heavy duster coat the color of dried, sun-baked blood. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shielding a face that looked as though it had been carved from the very canyon walls he had just climbed. But no hat, no matter how low, could hide those eyes. They were cold. They were sharp. They were the eyes of a predator that had seen everything and felt nothing. They called him the accountant, not because he dealt with ledgers or gold coins in a bank, but because he was the only man in the territories who could settle a debt that everyone else had deemed uncollectible. In the Wild West, some debts are written in ink, but the ones he collected were always written in lead. He stepped onto the porch of the derelict saloon, the last chance. The wood groaned and shrieked under his boots, a sound that echoed through the empty street like a dying man's last desperate breath. He didn't hurry. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew exactly how much time he had left, and exactly how little time everyone else had. He wasn't here for the gold that people whispered was still hidden in the dark. He was looking for a ghost named Silas Thorne. Inside the saloon, the air was thick and heavy. It smelled of stale whiskey, rotting timber, and 10 years of unwashed sins. The accountant didn't look at the cobwebs or the shattered mirrors. He walked to the back, to a corner table, the only one that wasn't broken, the only one that still stood defiant against the decay. He pulled out a chair, the screech of wood on wood sounding like a violin string snapping. He sat down and placed a single, tarnished silver coin on the scarred surface of the table. He didn't speak. He just stared at that coin. It was a blood debt, a token from a past that refused to stay buried. He remembered this room when it was full of life and violence. He remembered the screams that had once filled this air, screams that Silas Thorne and his gang had tried to drown out with laughter and gunfire. 10 years ago, Thorne had turned this town into a slaughterhouse just to keep the location of the Motherlode mine a secret. They thought they had killed every witness. They thought they had erased the past. But they had left one man alive, a man who had spent the last decade in the wilderness, learning the language of the gun and the art of the hunt. The accountant reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin, dark cigar. He struck a match on the underside of the table, the small flame illuminating his razor-sharp features for a brief, haunting second. As the blue smoke curled around his face, he closed his eyes, but his ears stayed open. He could hear the desert breathing outside. He could hear the scuttle of a scorpion across the floor. and he could hear the heavy, uneven breathing of men who were watching him from the shadows of the balcony above. He knew Silas Thorne was still here. Thorne was a rat who had built a nest in a tomb, guarding a fortune of gold that he could never spend in a world of living men. The accountant didn't need to go into the mines to find him. He knew that Thorne's greed was a hunger that never slept. Thorne would come to him. Minutes passed like hours. The cigar burned down, the ash growing long. The silver coin sat unmoved, a silent judge on the table. Then the heavy silence was broken. The sound of boots, not one pair, but many, approached from the darkness of the hallway. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and the light of a single lantern spilled down like spilled oil. Silas Thorne stood there. He was older now, his hair the color of ash, his face a map of scars and bad decisions. But he still carried that same cruel arrogance in his pale eyes. He looked down at the man in the corner and let out a dry, raspy laugh that sounded like dead leaves blowing across a grave. "I heard a ghost was in town," Thorne said, his hand resting on the ivory grip of a custom-made Colt Navy. "You're a long way from the grave, stranger. Why come to a place where only death lives?" The accountant didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from the coin. His voice, when it finally came, was like gravel grinding on stone, low, dangerous, and final. "I've come to audit your soul, Silas. I've been looking over the books, and I've found that you're deeply in arrears. 10 years of interest on a lot of spilled blood. It's time to settle the account." The air in the saloon turned to ice. Thorne's men moved into the light, their hands hovering over their holsters. Thorne's face twisted into a mask of rage. "The gold is mine! I bled for it! I killed every man, woman, and child who stood in my way. You think you can just walk in here and take what I built?" The accountant finally looked up. His eyes met Thorne's, and for the first time in 10 years, Silas Thorne felt a cold shiver of true fear. He realized he wasn't looking at a man. He was looking at his own end. 3 seconds, Silas," the accountant said softly. "That's all the time you have left to pray, though I doubt anyone is listening." 1. A vulture shrieked somewhere out in the black night. 2. Thorne's finger twitched against his trigger guard. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a cord stretched so tight it was about to snap. 3. The explosion of the accountant's revolver was like a clap of thunder in a small room. It was faster than the eye could follow, a flash of fire in the dim light. Silas Thorne didn't even have time to draw. He was thrown backward against the wall, a single neat hole appearing exactly in the center of his forehead, right where the silver coin had been pointing. He slid down the wall, leaving a dark trail behind him, his eyes wide and vacant. The 2 henchmen stood frozen, their shadows dancing on the walls. They looked at the accountant, who hadn't even stood up from his chair. He was already holstering his weapon with a slow, mechanical precision. "The debt is settled," the accountant said, his voice showing no emotion. "Leave the gold. It belongs to the earth now. If you stay, you'll be buried with it." The 2 men didn't wait. They turned and bolted into the night, their horses' hooves drumming a frantic rhythm as they fled into the safety of the desert. The accountant stood up and picked up the tarnished silver coin. He walked to the body of Silas Thorne and placed the coin on the dead man's chest. "Paid in full," he whispered. He walked out of the saloon and back into the cold night air. The moon was climbing high now, casting a silver light over the ruins of Rattlesnake Gulch. He climbed into his saddle and turned his horse toward the north. He didn't look back at the gold hidden in the mines, or the body in the bar, or the town that would now finally be allowed to disappear into the dust. He was a man with no home, no friends, and no future. Only a list of names, and tonight he had drawn a long red line through the most important one. As he rode into the darkness, the wind began to howl again, carrying away the dust and the memory of Silas Thorne. Justice had come to the gulch, not with a badge or a gavel, but with a cold stare and a heavy hand. The accountant was gone, but the desert would never forget the man with the dead fish eyes.